Well, welcome. I'm excited to be here with everybody today and to be talking about the parting from the four attachments for our summer fall teaching series of the students of Khenpo Sherab Sangpo. I'm really honored and humbled to be able to be here and speak with you about this topic today. I think we'll start similar to how Steve did last week with meditation. I really liked that format that he did, and I actually might go ahead and start building on the meditations that he had us do, because I think it fits in really well with the topic that we'll be discussing today, which is parting from the four attachments. And just a little bit of reminder of what I heard him speak about the last time he was here was really looking at those 12 links of interdependent origination and where the meat, so to speak, of Buddhism happens, and that is where we're between when a sense object and a sensory field come in contact, and what we do after that point. And what we do after that point is craving and grasping and becoming. And so it's that craving and grasping that we have when we have a feeling. First of all, we had the feeling on that sense object, is that we need to watch that. I mean, the whole essence of what we're doing when we're meditating is trying to, instead of grasping onto those thoughts that arise in our mind, is just watch them. So we have to employ mindfulness and watchfulness when we're sitting on the cushion meditating, so that we can watch those thoughts arise and just watch them and do nothing instead of grasping onto them. And by doing that, we're training our mind in a different way, to react in a different way than we typically react. We want to grasp onto that which we feel something about. We want to grasp onto it, we want to have attachment to it, and that's natural to us. So when we're meditating, we're changing at a very deep level the way our mind wants to react. And by doing that when we're on the cushion, it gives us the power to do that when we're not on the cushion. And that is the importance of the parting from the four attachments, as we'll talk about more as the class goes on. So our meditation today will be just to sit and breathe and to watch our thoughts, not try to make them come up, not try to suppress them, but just pay attention to our breathing. And if thoughts arise, or even if we get attached to watching our breathing, just to make note of it. Be aware of the fact that we've become aware of being attached to I'm counting my breath, or I'm breathing in, or I'm breathing out, or a thought has arisen, and just sit there and watch and do nothing. So that will be our meditation this morning. And Dan, you have a question?
I'm confused about watching. I don't watch. I'm
okay.
aware.
Be aware then. Just be aware.
I can't watch. I can't watch thoughts go.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
So be aware of them.
Yeah, I think being aware of.
And be aware of where they go. So it's like
where they go as long as they go.
So do what you can. Start where you're at and just start. That's a good process to start with. And so we'll meditate for about 20 minutes. That way we'll have that as part of our starting point when we go into the teaching. And with that, we'll start a meditation. So it was a short meditation. I think a nice one to get our minds calmed down a little bit before we start meditating. If we have time at the end, we could do another short meditation at the end as well. So how many people here have heard of the teaching parting from the four attachments? Just so I can get a sense of what people know about it. Okay. So I think Khenpo, he taught it originally to us several years ago. So it's been years since it's been taught. I think the first time he taught it, it was when Cortland was still around, so it was translated. And it is a teaching from the Sakya tradition. However, it is a teaching that is revered very, very highly by all four branches of Tibetan Buddhism. It's a very profound teaching, pith instructions, and mostly it's pith instructions about how to part from the four attachments in ordinary realm. So it's not a teaching on philosophy, it's not a teaching on debate, and it's not a teaching on meditation. It's a teaching on how we learn to part from those four attachments in daily life. And I'll go into a little bit more of that as well. A little bit of background of how these teachings came about is a Sakya master by the name of Sechen Kunga Ningpo, when he was 12 years old, went into a 6-month retreat to study the deity Manjushri and practice wisdom. And during that 6-month retreat, when he was 12 years old, he had a vision of Manjushri. And these parting from the 4 attachments came about as a result of the wisdom he gained during that retreat. And so very profound that someone of, I think, of someone of such that young age had come up with these beautiful teachings and had dedicated his life at such a young age to the Buddhist path. So this morning we said some prayers to Manjushri. Manjushri is a deity of wisdom. He cuts through ignorance with his sword, and so I've brought a few pictures of Manjushri here as well. One of my favorite deities, so I really feel attached to Manjushri as one of my guiding deities that I have on my altar. And so these teachings, I think, they have, there's 2 sides of it. There's an implicit teaching and there's an explicit teaching. Explicitly, this teaching is about attachment and how do we part from it. Implicitly, as most teachings in Buddhism, there's another behind-the-scenes teaching, and basically it's the entire path of Buddhism from being not on the path to achieving wisdom that these 4 lines encompass. So they can be seen as this mnemonic device that we can use to remind ourselves what do we need to do at each stage of the path, similar to the 9 yanas in the Enigma tradition. The whole path is embedded in those 4 partings from the 4 attachments. Explicitly, it's a teaching about attachment. As we all know, attachment is one of the 3 poisons, and the 3 poisons being attachment, aversion, and ignorance. And sometimes we think about 5 poisons, of which the other 2 stem from attachment, so that therefore it's really important, and that's pride and jealousy. And so at the core of these teachings is how do we do away with attachment? And as Steve talked about the last few teachings, letting go of attachment is one of the main activities as Buddhists that we try to work with when we make our mind more malleable. And by working with reducing our attachments, we are inherently also working with gaining wisdom and working with aversion, because attachment and aversion are 2 sides of the same coin. So, as I spoke of earlier when we started our meditation, there's also 2 ways of working with the mind. One is with meditation, and the other is with mind training. And this specific teaching is about mind training. It's not about meditation. But what I want to also let us know is that those 2 pieces are also very important in Buddhism. We can't just do mind training without meditation, and we shouldn't do meditation without mind training and knowing what our path is. We need both of those activities in order to reach our ultimate goal of attaining complete enlightenment for the welfare of all beings. And they're both tools in our tool set that we should always be using, as Khenpo stated many, many times. And one of the reasons why I wanted to do this teaching, not only because it is something that Khenpo taught us in the past, but this year he focused a lot on mind training. So I thought as a teaching that we can look at, how can we also look at another way of thinking about mind training for ourselves? So mind training is an antidote, and just as meditation is an antidote. And if we are meditating and we're training our mind to be watchful and to be aware and to let go of grasping while we're meditating, we can use that strength that we've gained while we're on the cushion, while we are looking at our attachments and our habitual patterns in the real world. And that's not an easy task at all. And the other thing that Kempo reminded us of when he taught this class originally is that none of us are Buddhists at this point in time. We're all aspiring to be enlightened. And so, even though it's hard work, we need to be patient with ourselves. We all have accumulated habitual patterns over lifetimes, over decades, over generations. And these habitual patterns that we have, both good and bad, but it's the bad ones or the unvirtuous ones that we're working with, are ones that we may not even know that we have, just because they've become such a big part of who we are. And so be patient with yourselves and be patient with others, and utilize all the skills that we have in order to reduce those attachments. And so I don't think it's something that I've heard frequently, but it is hard work, and we do need to look inward. That's something that we always hear. We look inward at the attachments that we have. We look inward at the habitual patterns that we have. And by looking, we're engaging mindfulness, and paying attention to what we do, we're engaging awareness or watchfulness. And then we make a choice to either create a new habit by specifically stopping that activity, or just watching and doing nothing. And by watching and doing nothing, we've cut that habitual pattern. We've started a new pattern, right? Does that make sense? And so, as we get into some of these attachments, especially the first attachment, we'll start looking at what those activities are. And as I have discussed in previous classes, you can equate our Buddhist path to any other kind of path that's out there in the world. I think last time I talked about the path from going from a non-runner to being a marathon runner. What are all the steps you need to take in place? And as I was preparing for this class, I thought about another set of teachings and another set of trainings that some people know about. I know about peripherally, but it's the 12 steps in Alcoholics Anonymous. And what would it be like to go from that first step of admitting we were powerless over our attachments, right? Over our attachments, to going directly to trying to help others. You have to go through those steps in between before you get to that point where you can actually be an enlightened being and help others with the wisdom that you've gained by going through that path. And how I equate the parting from the 4 attachments, that what phase that is taking a personal inventory, or at least that first attachment, which I'll get to. We need to look at ourselves and take our personal inventory and see all the ways and all these habitual patterns that we are engaging from day to day, and look at them and try to stop them in some way, and employ some type of antidote to change them and to become a better person. And we have a tool set for that. So with that, let's take a look at these parting from the 4 attachments. I gave you guys all handouts, and they're listed there, but I will read them. And they're beautiful, and they're very they're very short. And if you are attached to this life, you are not a true spiritual practitioner. If you are attached to samsara, you have no renunciation. If you are attached to your own self-interest, you have no bodhicitta. And if grasping fixation to phenomenal as truly existent arises, you do not have the view. And so those are the parting from the 4 attachments. And if you take a look at this, the attachments that you have when you're looking at this are in the first half of those sentences. You have attachment to this life is the first stage. You have attachment to cyclical existence, or samsara, which is the second stage. You have attachment to your own self-interest, which is the third stage. And you may have attachment within the view, which is the 4th stage. And how those 4 attachments relate to the path, you can see in the result of being attached to this life, is that you're not a true spiritual practitioner. You're not a person of the Dharma. So where I equate that with on the 9 yana grid is before you even get onto the path, you're just a regular person, right? You haven't really done the work or have made the initiatory steps to step onto the path. So then the result of working with being attached to this life and reversing that is that you become a person of the Dharma. You became a true, authentic spiritual practitioner. Now the second one, if you're attached to samsara, you have no renunciation. So once you work on that level, you think about what is renunciation? Where on the path Do you have renunciation? You have that in the path of the Hinayana. The Hinayana goal is to have renunciation. So once you are on path, once the Dharma has become the path, then that is where you're at with that second attachment and working with removing that second attachment. And I think of that first attachment at being attached to this life. What we're working at, what we're contemplating, is the first and the second outer preliminaries. Once again, you're at the very beginning. You're looking at, instead of looking at life and being attached to it, you're thinking about the preciousness of human life and how wonderful it is, and thinking about contemplating it could end at any time. So what do I need to do with that precious life while I have it? Instead of being attached to it, what can I do with that? And I'll talk more about that in this actual session today. The second attachment, being attached to cyclical existence, what we contemplate during those attachments is the third and the fourth outer preliminary. So the karma and its results, and renunciation. So what we end up at that end of the contemplating that third and fourth outer preliminary is renunciation. We have renounced, we have turned towards the Dharma, and now we are on the Hinayana path. Does that make sense? A lot of information packed in just 2 lines. The third attachment, if you are attached to your own self-interest, you have no bodhicitta. So once you're on the Hinayana path, the next thing to work on, the next attachment to work on, is the attachment to your own self-interest. And the opposite of that is gaining bodhicitta, relative bodhicitta, thinking more of others than you think of yourself. And now you have just transformed from the Hinayana path to the Mahayana path, and you're working at that loving kindness and generosity in the 6 paramitas actively as part of your path off the cushion. Once you have generated that, the next step is then to work on attachment within the view. And if grasping fixation to phenomena as truly existent arises, you don't have the view. So what we work on here is the Vajrayana path. We have moved from the Bodhisattva path onto the Vajrayana path, and we're looking at emptiness and ultimate bodhicitta. So in those 4 steps, in that little verse that we have just recited, we have the entire path of Buddhism, from not being a Dharma practitioner to having ultimate wisdom. And thus you can see why Manjushri was the guiding principle and force of this teaching for that young Sakya master when he was just a young boy. So attachment to this life. Once again, if you are attached to this life, you are not a true spiritual practitioner. And we've already learned the outer preliminaries. We know how to contemplate the outer preliminaries. How do we generate within ourselves, looking at how precious is this life? And my, oh my, it could end at any time. So getting your mind in that framework, really getting your mind in that framework is helps you to have the antidote for what we normally think of in our mundane world and how we're normally attached to this life. So by generating a feeling of preciousness and generating a feeling of this could end any time, it helps us get to that point eventually of renunciation. But what it should be doing for us right now in this contemplation is looking at the 8 worldly concerns, which is where all of us are at in our everyday life. And does anyone know what those 8 worldly concerns are? We should know this as Buddhists. We should know what those 8 worldly concerns are. There are 4 pairs. There are 4 pairs, and this is what we're contemplating in this attachment. And those 4 pairs are being concerned, wanting praise and avoiding blame, wanting gain and avoiding loss, wanting fame and avoiding insignificance, and wanting happiness and avoiding unhappiness. And so we are attached to praise, gain, fame, and happiness, and we avoid at all costs blame, loss, insignificance, and unhappiness. That's tough work. How do we do that when we are not secluded away in a monastery somewhere, but we're out here in the real world trying to make a living. It's not an easy task, and somehow we have to find a way to lessen our attachment to those 8 worldly concerns as Buddhists in order to be an authentic practitioner. And that's where the lesson from Khenpo is. We need to be patient with ourselves. And if we can just lessen their grip on us by just a little bit, that's a big deal. It's a really big deal, and it's really important as our foundation as Buddhists. And oftentimes, Khenpo says to us, just be content with what you have. And I sometimes am frustrated with how can we be content with what we have, because we need to work at what we want. We need to, we need to put food on the table. We need to pay the mortgage. We need to do all these different things. But it's an approach and it's a motivation. So it's mostly changing our motivation for doing all of those things. And that's what undermines those attachments. What is our motivation in our day-to-day activities? Once again, meditation helps us because it sets the foundation for our mind changing what we do on a regular basis. But then we need to look at ourselves, be watchful, be aware, and be mindful when they're out in the world. What are our motivations? What is motivating us on a day-to-day basis? And in the teachings on the parting from the 4 attachments, it talks about being an authentic practitioner and being an inauthentic practitioner. And in preparation for this class, I also read a book, which is basically a commentary on a commentary of the original Parting from the 4 Attachments. And I think Khenpo had us read this book when we were first taking his class. I got a lot of great information from here. So I'm going to summarize some of that. But if you ever get a chance and want a book to read, this is a really, really, really good book. And it's called Parting from the 4 Attachments by Chogyey Traichen Rinpoche. And as a practitioner, as a person of the Dharma, he talks about if our motivations for meditation, our motivations for contemplation, and our motivations for hearing the teachings are mixed with these 8 worldly concerns instead of being true, authentic motivations for attaining complete enlightenment for the welfare of all beings, then the results will be skewed. The results will be mixed. And so for all of us, our results of anything that we do are going to be mixed, right? We are not Buddhas yet. If we have the motivation of a bodhisattva, pure motivation, we'll have the result of a pure bodhisattva. If we have motivation partly of a bodhisattva and partly because we're unaware of what our true motivation is, then we'll have mixed results. Khenpo's talked about that a lot. If our motivation is purely the 8 worldly concerns, our result, maybe not immediately, but sometime in the future, will be the result of those 8 worldly concerns. So he warns against us engaging in Buddhist practice purely for our own self-welfare, and to look at, are we engaging in Buddhist practice for praise? Are we engaging in Buddhist practice for gain? Are we engaging in Buddhist practice for fame? And are we engaging it for out of wanting happiness, which is kind of interesting. We are all probably here because we want happiness. And I've heard some other spiritual practitioners, high teachers say, this is not for happiness. That's not why we're engaging in Buddhist practice. If we are engaging in Buddhist practice because we want happiness, we're on the wrong path. A result might be happiness, but that's not the motivation of why we're on the path. So it's a little bit counterintuitive. But once again, it's how do we cut through those motivations? Our motivation should always come back to gaining enlightenment for the welfare of all beings. Does anyone have any questions on that at all? I went through that a lot faster than I thought I would. So I'll move on to the next one, which I'm not as prepared to talk about, but I will talk about the second attachment, which is good. So we'll have more time at the end for the next class for the third and the fourth attachment. So once we think about those 8 worldly concerns, And we've looked at attachment to this life. Then we go ahead and we look at attachment to cyclical existence. And what does that mean? What does it mean to be attached to cyclical existence, to be attached to samsara? Well, as beings in the desire realm, we have desire as the basis for everything that we exist. We're also compounded phenomena. So we are made up of compounded items, which means we will change. And so what's often talked about when we look at attachment to cyclical existence or attachment to samsara is we're actually looking at our attachment and the activities that we engage in that result in suffering. So the three types of suffering: the suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, and the suffering that's inherent in us because we are in this desire realm. And what we work on is lessening our attachment to this existence so that we can lessen our resultant suffering. And those three types of suffering are just the plain old suffering that happens because of suffering, because things might happen in this world that cause pain, just pain in and of itself. Suffering of change is what happens when we want something and we get it and it changes. We want to have those four worldly concerns met, but at some point in time, everything changes. And so coming to an understanding that everything changes, coming to an understanding that yes, life is precious, yes, it changes, yes, it ends, helps us then with that suffering of change. And then finally, the suffering that's inherent as part of who we are until we achieve enlightenment helps us to propel us then to want to do something to change it. So inherent suffering is the suffering of not being fully enlightened. And that will only go away when we become fully enlightened. When we're able to sit in that emptiness and that spontaneity and that clear light, does that suffering, that type of suffering, go away? And that's what we can work at attaining. And we work at attaining that by then contemplating the third and the fourth outer preliminary, thinking about karma and its results. What happens if we engage in those four worldly concerns of wanting this and the four of wanting to avoid that other thing? If we continue to engage in those, there will be karmic results that will hurt us and harm us. And then once we contemplate karma and the pitfalls of samsara, then we can go on to contemplate the fourth outer preliminary, which is renunciation, turning our minds towards the Dharma. So once again, here we are. We have abandoned the path of an ordinary person. We have stepped onto the path of the Dharma, and we start working at renunciation. And now we are fully on that Hinayana path of renunciation. And then we eventually go on to the next levels and the next levels and the next levels. But you have to start bit by bit, little by little on that path. Any questions or discussions that anyone has about what we've talked about so far?
An easy question.
I hope I can answer it.
Like you personally.
Yeah.
What's the difference between attachment and appreciation? If somebody asked me that, I'd have my answer. But
Yeah.
I'm interested in your answer.
I think of attachment as like grasping at something, right? You're grasping and you're desperate and you're needy. I mean, and that is what attachment is. Appreciation is joy. It's more like, joyful celebration, either for someone else's success or for your own success. It's like that third of the four lines of bodhicitta.
So you can have appreciation for a human existence and samsara, and
Yeah, so that's what we're trying. We should have an appreciation for life. This life is amazing. But how do we utilize that life in a good way, right? How do we not let it go to waste? And that's where the teachings come into play. So how do we make good use of this life? We can have fun. Fun is a good thing. We should be a little bit mindful if that fun is hurting someone else. But if it's not hurting anyone else, I mean, the point of these teachings is to live a good life, to live it mindfully and aware. And there are so many ways that we can embody that enlightened principle. You know, not all of the deities are the same, right? They all embody a little bit different. Vajrasattva is different than Manjushri, is different than Kuan Yin. They all embody some different beautiful principle. And as individuals, we will embody whatever gifts it is that we have, but we want to use those gifts in a good way to bring more happiness to the world and less suffering. Does that help?
Yeah.
All right. Great question.
Great answer.
All right.
So your first attachment.
Yeah.
The first attachment from Manjushri is attached to this life.
Mm-hmm.
Will you share some specific examples of what it means to be attached to this life?
Ah, sure. So, as different from being appreciative for this life, right, and thinking of it as precious, being attached to this life specifically are those 8 worldly concerns. Wanting fame, wanting gain, wanting glory, wanting happiness, wanting to avoid unhappiness, avoid loss. What was written in this book were some really good examples of that. If we engage in activity that on the outside might look like it's a good activity, but we're doing it mostly for our own fame, like if we're trying to get famous, and we're trying to get famous, and we're say I want to try to find a dharmic example and maybe a non-dharmic example. The whole purpose of owning a football franchise is to be famous. Maybe there's one owner of the franchise. He just wants to be famous, and that's his goal. And that will be, and if that is his goal, if that's his underlying goal, that particular football franchise may be successful, right? But it might be tainted with his own personal desires. He will guide that franchise based on the fact that he wants to be famous. There's another person who owns another football franchise, and their goal is, I want to have a really good team. I want my team to do well on the field. I want them to be happy. I want them to win. I don't care about my own well-being. I just love football, and I want to own this football team because I love this sport. Both teams may be successful, but there will be a different experience with the people involved in those, and different experience when you win or when you lose. There'll be a different experience of if you do well or if you don't do well. And if I can find it, I think I have, I hope I didn't delete this example. I actually have an example from a quote from John Wooden. He's a famous basketball coach, right? You're aware of him. He's someone, I think, who has a really good perspective on what motivates him. I don't think he's someone who's motivated by those 8 worldly concerns. He's motivated by having a great team and doing well and having good character. And the quote he says is, be more concerned with your character than your reputation. Your character is who you really are, while your reputation is what others think you are. So take that away as an example, perhaps, of being motivated by the external world, versus motivated by the internal world. That internal world is character versus fame versus praise versus wealth versus happiness. And he motivated his basketball teams on a moral compass rather than on an external focus. And as a result, his teams did really well. So they had the same result. They were a winning team, but they weren't motivated by those worldly concerns. Is that good? All right.
How do you actually practice the first 2 lines? So if you were, I know you
Yeah.
said that
Yeah.
this is more mind training than meditation.
Right.
If you wanted to practice it and in some ways integrate it into your
Right.
meditation, do you have some suggestions on that?
So meditation, yes, I do have some suggestions. I think we need to meditate. We need to do all the practices that we have been taught, and do them authentically. And when we're sitting on the cushion meditating and our mind starts to wander, really be aware of that and really fight that as much as we can while we're on the cushion, because it's so easy to do. And I think that's why we have all these different methods, especially the Vajrayana methods. I find them more helpful. When we were sitting here doing our meditation early on and I gave you guys all directions, I was having a really hard time doing that until I started practicing a little bit of deity practice, because that helped rein in my mind. My mind is incorrigible. And so having those methods helps me to rein it in and to come back to focus, and then maybe a little bit of space happens. So continue doing our practices very diligently and very diligently, being aware and being mindful of when we stop, and being patient with ourselves when we go off track a little bit. It happens to the best of the masters. If we are able to gain a little bit of space, that's success. And gradually, we'll get up to that where we have a lot more space. Off the cushion, I like the idea of comparing it to working a 12-step program, of taking a personal moral inventory. And for myself, being open to feedback when people give it to me and not reacting immediately. It's hard to do. It's not easy. We don't do it well. And I think a good teacher will give us feedback in a way that's easy to digest. That's what makes them a really good teacher. And that's what our teachers are supposed to do. They're supposed to point out to us when we are engaged in activities that aren't good for ourselves or good for our practices. For myself, what I try to do is, if something has arisen in me, a reaction that I'm going to react in a way that is not authentically dharmic, is to first of all, be aware of it. And if I have enough space built up to just do nothing. And if I have enough wherewithal, is then to employ something completely opposite. Like saying thank you, right? If someone says something about me that I don't like, wow, how disarming it is for myself and for that other person than to say thank you. Or, something to that effect. I mean, there's any amount of activity that we can be involved in when we're looking at ourselves in a hard way. Be patient. First of all, be patient. Second of all, be aware and change the activity. And sometimes changing the activity is just doing nothing. And that's what the essence of the Buddhist practice is. That makes sense. Yeah. It's not easy. And be patient with ourselves, because we're all involved in it. It's rampant through everything, and that's why we're on the path. So, any other questions?
So again, back to the first one.
Yeah.
So there's
Yeah.
8 worldly concerns.
Yeah.
So we know, I think I have what those are.
Yeah.
If our motivation is supposed to not be that, those 8.
Lesson. Mm-hmm.
Lesson. What is the motivation supposed to be? So if it's not these,
Yeah.
please describe a dog to me by telling me what it's not.
Right.
What does
So,
this dog look like?
motivation is generosity for the wealth and enlightenment for the welfare of all beings.
So moving from the 8 worldly concerns to the paramitas and the 4 boundless qualities.
Yeah. Yeah. 4 boundless qualities. Yeah. Yeah. 4 boundless qualities. 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 Yeah. 4 And in our real world, that's not always going to be the case, but if we can lessen those habitual patterns, we'll slowly move towards that goal. And I think we have the goal set really high, the bar set really high. If we can move from, and I don't think any of us in this room would be where we're completely enmeshed in those 8 worldly concerns, or I don't think we'd be in this room right now, right? So we're somewhere in between. We're on the path. We're working towards this goal, but by having that goal set very, very high, it's not necessarily means that we're going to attain it, but we're working towards it, and somewhere in there, we're going to be better people, and the people around us are going to be better as well, the world around us. An enlightened society is a possibility. So, and we can have a world of enlightened society within the bigger world that's not enlightened, right? As you change yourself, the world around you changes. It's that spontaneity. You are what's attracted to you and what you're attracted to changes, and it just seems like everything else may fall away. You still have your challenges, right? You'll still have this bigger world that we should then try to enlarge our view even bigger to try to help the bigger world if we're capable of it. The results spontaneously arise. Great. Let's end with a little bit more meditation. And let's end with doing some very specific breathing meditation about breathing in, holding it, and watching it very gently. Don't hold it as in terms of forcefully holding it, but just let go of breathing in and let go of breathing out. That's that space. And then gently breathe out again. We've all learned that meditation in the past. And once again, if thoughts arise, just come back to the breathing. And if you get to a point where you're doing that 3-stage breathing, just let go and be in the moment. If thoughts arise, come back to the thought of the breathing. And we'll end our session that way. And then we'll do some closing prayers.